start with saying thank you to all our partners, Engage, ISPU, MPAC, Pluralism Project, and everybody else who has helped us to bring all of you out here today. I can't thank you enough. I also want to do a quick shout out for all those people who have been working tirelessly. The interns, where are you? Please hold up your hands quickly so that they can see you all. Like a little bit higher. Oh, no, other interns too, sure, why not? All interns, hold up your hands. Okay, interns, you see the whole government runs with interns. It is my honor to introduce a very special person who is the reason why we're here today. Honorable Congressman Swazi is a very special congressman, and I'll tell you why. First of all, he has been a mayor of Glen Cove, Long Island, and he was a two-term county executive, and he has been a congressman for a couple of years. But what makes him unique and special is that he is a congressman who has a very large Muslim constituency, a vibrant Muslim constituency. And Congressman visits their homes. He goes to every Eid prayer, he goes to iftars, and believe it or not, he even goes to retirement parties. I mean, which congressman goes to retirement parties, right? And he has something where he is a listening congressman. He actually hears from his constituents. He really believes that. He holds a monthly town hall with his constituents. It's called Heard in the Third, because his district is the third district, so they are heard. And I can't tell you enough, when he got wise up from my uncle who gave it to him and said, oh, by the way, here's something, and he read it and he found it very compelling, and so he said, let's do this. What do we need to do to help you? So he's hosting this congressional briefing for us today. He's the reason why we're here. And Congressman Swazi, thank you so much for everything that you do. And I know that your message is very critical right now in this moment in this nation when there's so much division. And you are uniting people in your district, and we want you to share those words with others. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daisy, and good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm just happy. Thanks for that introduction. Daisy's a wonderful. Where did she go? Oh, hi. She's a great personal friend and a wonderful person, and she's overemphasized what I've done to help you. All I did is get the room, and this is really a wonderful group that I look out on here. People that are interested in such an important topic that we face at this time. My first election for county executive was a Democratic primary on September 11th of 2001, and it was in New York. And of course, this is, we were really at ground zero paying attention to this issue, and I've seen the discrimination since day one. I've always thought about the issue of discrimination and lack of education and understanding, and this document is so important just because it educates people. That's the main thing that we're trying to do, is get people to talk to each other, understand each other, and recognize that there's so much more that we share in common than what divides us. And unfortunately, because of what we see in the media these days, most of what we see about Muslims and Muslim Americans is negative and related to negative context. And this is so important that people are talking and trying to educate each other, and then to spread that word out to other people throughout our nation. Discrimination is a very important part of our nation's history, not just of Muslims, but throughout from the very beginning. When the Dutch first came to America, and the first settlers after the Native Americans, of course, they discriminated against the English when they came next. And then the Dutch and the English discriminated against the Germans, and the Dutch and the English and the Germans discriminated against the Irish, and then it was the Italians and the Jews, and now it's the Latinos and the Muslims are in the frying pan, so to speak. And this is a very real part of my life. I'm a first-generation American. My father was born in Italy, came to the United States as a young boy, and lived a great American success story. First went to go to college, fought in World War II as a navigator on a B-24, got the Distinguished Flying Cross, came back, went to Harvard Law School, faced tremendous discrimination when he tried to join a law firm. But people really realized how much Italians were discriminated against in America. It seems like a foreign concept right now. But my father died 2 weeks before my election in 2016. He was 95 years old. And I looked through his yearbook, his high school yearbook from St. Dominic's High School. And in his yearbook, they asked, what's your goal in life? And he said, my goal is to be a real American. Other people wrote things like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to do this, I want to travel to these exotic places. He said, my goal is to be a real American. Now, I'd seen that yearbook when I was a kid, and I thought, wow, 18 years old, how could he have been so patriotic at such a young age that he would think of something like that to say? When he passed away in 2016, during the election cycle, in October of 2016, I started thinking about it, and my father was 18 years old when he graduated from high school in 1939. And Italian Americans were very much discriminated against in America at the time because Mussolini had teamed up with Hitler, and as a result, every Italian American was a fascist or in the mafia. And German Americans and Japanese Americans at the time were very much discriminated against because of what was going on in the biases at the time. And it was a long journey, a lot of education, a lot of hard work by a lot of great Americans, like men and women like my father and my grandparents, that helped to overcome that discrimination. So this is a very hopeful and important journey that you are making here, that has the promise of making America live up to the promise that is America, that all men and women are created equal. Not that all men and women with a green card, or all men and women from a particular country, or all men and women from a particular religion are created equal, that all men and women are created equal. And it's a constant effort of good people like yourselves taking the leadership of people who devoted a big part of their lifetimes to understanding these issues and educating people about how we're really in this all together. So I want to thank all of you for doing this. It's very, very important work, and I'm very hopeful that it'll have real results working together. Thank you very much, everybody. Daisy, thank you so much for including me.
I also want to do a quick shout out to somebody's glasses. Is that Tom? Are those your glasses? Without the support of certain people, Wise Up would not have been possible. I don't want to name any names, but there are some people in this room that have really lent incredible resources so that we could have realized this goal. I want to thank those people. We now begin with the program. As Tom mentioned, that this issue of otherness and challenges of communities is a historical narrative of America, and every community is going through it, and so is the American Muslim community. So since 9/11, our community literally has been in the crosshairs of the war on terror, and we are largely defined through a lens of national security, and that has real consequences for our community, including hate crimes on the rise, the linking of great global religion, which is practiced by 1.6 billion people, constantly to terrorism, which has real-time consequences for us and for our future generations in this country. And so we set out to change this narrative because, as Tom mentioned, that every condemnation that Muslims have done has not been reported in the press. I know that for a fact. In fact, when we published this Wise Up tool, a very massive tool with 72 contributors, the press didn't come. So what are Americans to think? What are they to think if the press doesn't cover us? And I bet there's nobody here from the press today. So we can say all we want, but if the public does not know what we're saying and who we are, then there is a negative perception about our community. So this is what happens. The press plays a major role in shaping perceptions. We're not blaming anyone, we're just saying this is a fact. These public perceptions of Islam and Muslims shape policies, which ultimately, give lawmakers are making a lot of their policies on disinformation about Islam and Muslims. So we set out to fix this problem. For 15 years I've been at it, and I remember very distinctly going to a meeting with the former Commissioner Ray Kelly of NYPD, when many of you know what was happening at the NYPD, and he created an advisory council. And I was at that advisory council, and at one of the meetings he said, "What do you expect us to do? 3,000 people died and Muslims did it." And that was a decade after 9/11. I was stunned. And then, a few years after that, with almost quarterly meetings with him one-on-one. And when he retired, I asked him, "What do you think of the Muslim community now?" Because for 2 years, he'd been going to the houses of worship, he'd been going to the iftars, he'd been going to their functions, And you know what he said? He said they are the most hospitable people I know, and I love going to their mosque because it's a beautiful, safe, sacred space. And I realized then, this is where the work lies, in changing hearts and minds and educating people, transforming the conversation. This is what we've set out to do today. Fill the gap in lawmakers' understanding of Islam and Muslim, provide a blueprint for combating disinformation about Muslims and Islam, and provide practical ways to prevent the growth of extremism. Why am I saying growth of extremism? Because although we set out to do this, but Daesh and ISIS and all those other people who have really hurt our community more than they hurt any other community, as you know, that Muslims are the greatest victims of terrorism. But we've now seen violence in the United States. We've seen gun violence. We've seen so much mayhem in this country. So we know that extremists cannot be only found in one community, one religion, that they actually have a lot in common. So this is the discussion we'll be also having today. So we came up with Wise Up, 72 contributors. So some of the people that are on this panel are here. They're contributors to Wise Up. And we spent 3 years in creating a 375-page document, something that is easy, accessible information. You will be getting a copy today. And it has 3 distinct sections. The first section, we really wanted to tell our own story. Who are American Muslims? Why are we seen through a security lens? When we're such a vibrant community, but what challenges are we going through? And we wanted to go all the way back to the history of Islam in America. Who are we? How long have we been here for? Did we just arrive? As many people think we just arrived on the boat yesterday. Well, not true. Islam has been in America, has been part of America from the very beginning, starting from colonial times. Many slaves brought here from Africa were Muslim. And Thomas Jefferson even explained in Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he wrote, was designed to protect all faiths. He included Muslim in there. So if you tell me Islam is not an American religion, then what is that all about? So we also included a lot of frequently asked questions that people constantly ask us. I'm just going through this entire section. This has 27 articles. So I'm just highlighting a few things for the purposes of all of you to know what is in this. And then we ended it with 35 notable American Muslims. Because Tom said, it's obvious that you are going to highlight the Muslims that are Muslims. But it's always surprising when you see somebody like Dave Chappelle, you're watching him at night, and then you go, oh my God, he's a Muslim, I didn't know that. Or you're eating your Chobani yogurt every morning, and you don't realize that this was a Kurdish, Turkish immigrant who came to this country and set up a yogurt factory, and now everybody eats that. He's a Muslim. Dr. Oz giving you all your smoothies and everything else, well, he's a Muslim. So we wanted to re-educate people. Muslims are integral and they're contributing significantly to America. Part 2, Islamic theology versus extremist ideology. We want to de-link the religion of Islam. Actually, we want to de-link every religion from terrorism. Because it is not right to link a religion to terrorism. It's people who commit terrorist attacks, not religions. So we set out to do this, but first we want to educate Americans who we are. Who are Muslims? What is our history? Why do we love our religion so much? Why do we love the Prophet so much? So this is a crash course for Muslims as well as non-Muslims, just to know what are our beliefs. What do we believe in? And then you realize, actually, these beliefs are not that different in Judaism, Christianity, and great world religions. And what are the 5 pillars? What do we practice when they say, oh, they're doing Sharia in their room, in their mosque? Well, guess what? We're eating, we're fasting, we're, celebrating, and Tom will tell you that. He comes to a lot of our gatherings. And then, of course, the big 80-pound gorilla question, Sharia. It's so scary to people. But is it really that scary? What is the objective of Sharia? It's to further life, to protect life, to promote life, to further and protect religion. And when I say religion, I don't mean just Islam. I mean all religions. So if anybody tells you that Christians and Jews are not to be honored and respected, that's wrong theologically. Mind, furthering the mind, education, honor, property, wealth, dignity, personal dignity, family and lineage. These are the 6 principles of Sharia, objectives of Sharia. And guess what? They were written 1,000 years ago. This is not something Johnny-come-lately that we just did yesterday. But then we get into more serious subject. Why is our religion being weaponized? And how is it being weaponized? And we are saying this to you because other religions are getting weaponized right now. I don't have to tell you what they are. You see it in the news. But I want to warn everybody that weaponizing religion is an ancient way to mobilize people. And so it has happened to our religion. and we refuse to let it happen anymore, and this is why we delved into Daesh and ISIS's research, and we wanted to see how they do it, so that we can prevent our communities globally as well as locally from this nemesis. So this is how we laid it out. We show the concept, we show the true meaning of it, and then we show a fake meaning of it. And when I say true and fake, I don't mean true and another interpretation. I mean fake, as in completely distorted, completely corrupted, and completely propagandized for a particular political goal. That's what the goal is. And now, as State Senator Cousins said, it's been written, it's been shown, you've heard it, you've seen it. There's no reason now to actually distinguish the two. So this is the reason why we are dealing in Islam. Third section, preventing extremist recruitment. We wanted to show you how recruitment is done online, because a lot of recruitment is done mostly on social media, how it's done online. 16 steps of recruitment. Actually, in your book, you will see a detail, each step, what is said and how it's said and how these terms are being used. But then we wanted to show you the 21st century marketing gimmicks that extremist groups use. And now a lot of this is now getting replicated here in the United States by newer groups who are borrowing from the playbook of ISIS, using and marketing their ideology, whatever that might be, using these platforms of social media. You can see from this that ISIS doesn't appear to the person who is listening to them as a terrorist group. They actually appear like a cool place to be. It's fun, there's a party going on, you know, you can be a hero, and you can have health services, you'll have justice, women's empowerment, all of these things that appeal to different people. So it's really a cool place to be. And I'm speaking from experience because I've actually gone into detention centers and spoken to some people. And so they're actually not looking for heaven, they're actually looking for a fun place to be. And that's what this recruitment looks like to them. We also wanted to show, you know, that in today's highly polarized political climate, it seems that the speech, dangerous speech, and hate speech has just become, you know, the repercussions of this hate speech have really real consequences for our community and for other communities as well. So we actually had a, wonderful Scott Cooper and Rachel Brown have done this wonderful document called Countering Hate Speech. How do you actually counteract it? How do you transform people one-on-one? This is a very useful template. Please read this section. It's wonderful. We put it in here because we want to stop hate speech in our tracks here in the United States. And finally, why did we include a hero section? We included a hero section because one of the lures of extremist groups is that you will become a hero if you join us. That because people are so dissatisfied in their lives, something is going on in their lives, so they want to be a hero. And so we said, okay, maybe we should tell people who real heroes are. Real heroes are people who save lives. They don't take lives. That's what a real hero is. That's the definition of a hero. And why did we include Amir Abdul Qadir? Because how many of you know that the Geneva Convention's basis is Islamic theology? Raise your hand. Okay, there are few people. Did you know that Amir Abdul Qadir was an Algerian? He fought the French. He resisted against them. He was a real, a hero in the sense that he fought a heroic, just war. And the way he treated his prisoners was so honorable that Henry Durand, the Swiss Calvinist and humanitarian activist who founded the Red Cross, said, "Who is this man? And why is he treating these prisoners so well?" And when he discovered the treatment of prisoners, he said, this should be the basis of the Geneva Convention. And today there's a bust of Amir Abdul Qadir along with him right outside the where is it? Huh? International Red Cross in Geneva. So how many Muslims know that the Geneva Convention actually comes out of Islamic theology because this man was actually a scholar? So we included him, and you have a little write-up about him. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because we're going to illuminate his life even more and bring it to life. So this September 12th, there's going to be a forum in New York. If you would like you to attend, you'll get an email from me on that. Finally, today's goal is the goal of the briefing is to present best practice on how to foster unity and mutual respect amongst diverse communities, because we are part of these communities, shift narrative on American Muslims from one focused on security to a frame that recognizes them as contributors to American society. And then finally, educate and enhance interaction between American Muslims and their representatives, we have a real life example with Tom Swazi of how he interacts with his constituencies. And we want to make that a model for other communities, who don't know how to do it. So part one, we will focus on extremism as a phenomenon that has commonalities across religions, races, and cultures. And Rachel Brown is going to join me in this conversation, and I will just highlight for you. In your book, you will see a lot of research on ideological foundations of Daesh and ISIS and other extremist groups, but we wanted to highlight for you what are the common themes that run through these groups, whatever extremist groups they are. Us versus them is always one. You know, they label others as enemies and justify their hatred, maintaining purity, consider themselves to be the chosen people or the pure race, whatever that definition is. Pessimism about the state of the world. In the vernacular of ISIS, it's Islam. We want to make Islam great again because somebody's made it ungreat. And then in the case of people here, we want to make America great again because somebody's done something to ungrate us. And then rejectionist and fanatical, obsessive mindset prevents them from tolerating other views and even reject those who strive for change peacefully. So I am not part of their, I would be their enemy because I'm trying to do change peacefully. So why do people join? Many people say that Muslims join ISIS because they hate our freedoms. Well, guess what? Our research does not show that at all. There's no evidence of that. There are so many complex reasons why people join and the dissatisfactions that people have at the individual level that is extremely complex and it's interrelated, and it can be seeking a spiritual path, it can be a bleak future outlook, it can be suffering and injustices, us against the rest of the world, disaffected political status quo, marginalization, alienation, disconnected from Western culture, or for example of glory and heroes, as I mentioned before. But guess what? On the other side, there's an invitation. There's always a siren song. We have a solution to all your problems. And these vulnerabilities actually they are very complex, and people can be vulnerable in many different ways, and they can be relational, which is family, it can be social identity, it can be political, personal, and external. The reason why we want to have the conversation about external, it's really important, because what government says and this polarized societal debates really affect the way people perceive themselves. Government positioning on poorly understood national and international issues affects people. Highly sensationalized public and media discourse affects people. And extremist discourse and propaganda that is readily available online also makes it easy for people to become vulnerable. I mean, I have heard stories of somebody going on YouTube just looking for some basic information, and all of a sudden they get new YouTube videos that they weren't even seeking. You know, how they send you more things like, oh, if you really want to do some more jihad, here's some more extra stuff. So this is the stuff we need to stop. This is the stuff we need to go to social media companies and say, we need to stop that. So I'm going to go back. And so we are here today to talk about these external factors, but I would like to now ask my colleague, Rachel Brown, to lend her expertise, because Rachel has been working in other communities, and she is going to shed light on her experience and also her research of what are the commonalities between the various groups. And Rachel, if you could just introduce your organization very briefly, and then
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daisy. So, as Daisy mentioned, my name is Rachel Brown. I am the executive director of Over Zero, and we work to help societies resist division based on different parts of identity that get mobilized to divide us. And my background and Over Zero's work really focus in the fields of peace building and genocide and atrocity prevention. So I'm coming from this broader lens of looking at how societies become polarized and divided, and how it becomes accepted as justified, necessary, even praiseworthy to target entire groups of people with harm, with violence, solely based on their identity. And we focus specifically on the role that communication plays in driving division, violence, and extremism, and in how we can mobilize communication instead to prevent division and to prevent violence. And in all of our work, we use a very interdisciplinary approach. We draw on fields as diverse as conflict studies and cognitive neuroscience, because we know that these are complex and very human issues and processes that we need to understand. And what I want to point out today is that in our work, again, we're looking at how societies themselves become more extreme, become more divided, come to accept violence as an option, to target different groups. And throughout our work, whether it's in historical or current examples, we see critical commonalities in the processes that are moving societies towards this type of polarization and identity-based violence. And so, as Daisy previously mentioned, we see these us-them divisions that unfold. And in these us-them divisions, a targeted group is not only othered and dehumanized, but very importantly, is painted as a threat. They're painted as often either a threat to the physical security of the group that's being mobilized to protect itself, or even as a contaminant, as a threat to the purity of a group. And so we see this dehumanizing language that invokes that type of threat across contexts, where, for example, during the Holocaust, groups were compared to rodents. During the Holocaust, Jews were compared to rodents, and Tutsi were compared to cockroaches during the Rwandan genocide. And so this creates a narrative that describes violence against an entire group, including women, children, civilians, as self-defense, right? So it's justified. And alongside this, we also see this collectivizing of groups, the idea that the group that's being targeted is somehow pure or similar in essence. And so entire groups, and again, this includes civilians, children among them, are painted as being guilty of either past or recent crimes that were committed by individual members of that group. So there's this sort of collectivizing of guilt and of blame for an entire group, and they're painted as essentially criminals. And so violence in this case is understood by the group being mobilized for it as necessary for the survival of the group mobilized to commit it, but also as retaliatory and punitive. And so while this othering is going on, and while this construction of threat and guilt of a group that's being targeted is happening, it's really important to also pay attention to what's happening within that us side of the us-them divisions. The group that's being mobilized for violence, there's often strong social pressure to support and encourage violence, or at the very least, accept it and stay silent. And so people who speak out are labeled sort of on one end of the spectrum as weak or as naive, and on the other end of the spectrum as traitorous, or in collaboration with that other threatening group. And so again, you see how groups become more extreme because the voices within them that can prevent that type of extremism are shut down. They're speaking out there, they're putting the group at risk by suggesting that violence isn't the only option, that it shouldn't be used, that dialogue, that other types of interventions or actions could be used. And again, across contexts, what we see is that when societies mobilize to become more extreme, the communication comes from very credible messengers. It comes from people who play different leading roles in society, whether at the community, regional, national levels, and it's spread through high-impact channels of communication, which may change over time. And so, and so just to give a couple of examples, I mean, we see these same processes regardless of race, religion, geography, time period. We saw them in Nazi Germany. We saw them during the genocide in Rwanda and the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And while sometimes it can seem like it's different because now communication gets spread through channels like social media in addition to more traditional forms of communication like speech or the radio, we still see these processes today. We see them today in Myanmar, we see them in many places throughout the world, and we can also see them in the recruitment strategies that are used by extremist groups, whether ISIS or neo-Nazi groups that are mobilizing. They're dependent on those us-them divisions. They're dependent on the portrayal of that in-group as heroic and protecting its own, and the portrayal of an out-group and other as some sort of a threat. And so, again, while these exact narratives and the content and the details of conflict vary across time periods and across conflict, these patterns exist. We can observe these patterns because it's all humans. And so humans share emotions, we share psychological, neurological, social, and other different processes and tendencies. So, for example, we share a strong and powerful need to belong, which you can see in many of those drivers that Daisy outlined. We form groups, and we need to belong as part of groups, so once we're part of them, for our survival, we need to stay in them. So we're very sensitive to social pressure and social norms. And we're also very highly sensitive and responsive to any threats that we perceive in our environment. So emotions like fear or disgust are very powerful. And so these human tendencies and these processes are at play when we see societies at large become more extreme. They're also at play, as Daisy just outlined, in many of the factors that motivate and drive people towards extremism. Whether it's neo-Nazi groups, gangs, or ISIS, there are also common factors. And we can observe that, again, across contexts, individuals joining extremist groups, or even those just participating in violence as societies as a whole become more extreme, like in genocides and mass atrocities, can be influenced by a variety of factors. These include a need to belong, a personal history of trauma, the desire to obtain a sense of purpose and respect, the desire to avenge the wrongs that their group members have suffered and maybe attain some status and respect for doing so, a need to address threats that they believe their group faces, and sometimes also their own need for survival, which they can obtain through relationships in these groups and also through opportunities for material gain. So I'm going to close just by making a couple notes about what we know about how we can respond to these challenges. In order to prevent violence and extremism, it's really critical that we invest in understanding the processes that drive them across groups and across contexts. So if we want to understand extremist recruitment, for example, we need to look at recruitment to ISIS. We need to look historically at recruitment to extreme movements in the past and to current neo-Nazi groups, and even to organized gangs, so that we can find these commonalities, these patterns, and understand what processes are really at play. And to do this effectively, we need to bring together a lot of different types of knowledge. We need knowledge from different academic disciplines. We need knowledge from the people who are on the front lines and who are addressing these issues in their communities and understand the specifics of violence and how it's unfolding, being mobilized and recruited for in their local context. We need to know how new technologies are being leveraged to organize, spread, and recruit for violence. We also need, again, knowledge from across different contexts so that we can compare, and across different extremist groups so we can find the underlying patterns. And then finally, in this conversation, we're talking about radicalization and extremism. And our work on addressing these issues of polarization, violence, and extremism in societies teaches us that it's very critical to do two things simultaneously. First, it's critical to address the extremes, these groups that are recruiting, radicalizing. And second, it's absolutely critical to identify and address the things that make it a fertile ground for recruitment. The seeds of these us-them narratives, the idea that an entire group can be a threat or can be guilty of current or even historical crimes, the idea that violence is the only option, or that entire groups share even an essence and a responsibility. And so by doing these two things, by looking at the extremes and at the seeds and narratives and divisions that emerge in society as a whole, we can ensure that we don't create a fertile ground for identity-based extremism and divisions, again, which depends on feeding on these us-them narratives and divided societies. And we can also simultaneously use the best possible tools to address extremism and prevent radicalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And you have your policy briefs with you, but I will just highlight the three things that we think need to be done, the recommendations. So a recommendation is to conduct a community-led comprehensive study to understand the overarching framework and commonalities shared by extremist groups, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, and culture, and convene a privately funded community task force which receives input from stakeholders that have been dealing with extremism. Second, to develop targeted training for various communities, group leaders, educators, law enforcement agencies on practical ways that communities can prevent extremism from taking root. Create a national public service announcement focused on increasing awareness of tactics that all extremist groups use, especially on social media, in targeting young people. Because when young people get incarcerated, especially Muslim young people who get incarcerated, and Dalia will speak about that, sometimes they get 20 years just by providing some sort of online support. That's devastating to families, communities, because not only does one person get impacted, entire communities get shunned. So we really want to do this public address to let people know the dangers of all sorts of extremism. I would like to now start with the next part two, public officials who are supposed to be religiously neutral, often publicly link terrorist attacks with the religion of Islam. More specifically, you all know this, we hear terms like radical Islam, Islamic terrorism constantly linked, and it creates a linkage in the minds of people that somehow Islam itself is a flawed religion. And we really want to stop that from happening because it has real time consequences. I would like to invite Arslan Suleiman, who is actually a contributor to Wise Up. He has written an article, and he will actually talk about two specific things, and then Susanna Cunningham, Executive Director of Only Through Us. Arslan is not only a contributor, he was the former envoy to OIC. Many of you know him in the DC circles, but now he's a full-time lawyer. Arslan.
Thank you so much, Daisy, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll just get right into it. The section that I'm here to speak about is what is the impact of anti-Muslim rhetoric? What is the impact of Islamophobia? And unfortunately, there are very real human consequences to what we're seeing, especially the latest increase that we've seen in the past few years. The data, there are various organizations, civil society groups like CARE, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and others who track hate crimes and other incidents of discrimination. The FBI also does so. There's a voluntary program that the FBI has where it solicits this type of data on particular types of crime, bias-motivated crimes, etc., from law enforcement agencies across the country, state and localities. And although this data is incomplete for various reasons, because many of these localities don't actually report as they should be doing, and many victims don't feel comfortable reporting to law enforcement agencies in different ways, it still provides us with a barometer of the increase in attacks and other incidents. In 2015, if you look at the data from 2015 as compared to what happened in 2014, there was an increase of 67% of anti-Muslim hate crimes occurring. If you look at the 2016 data, those incidents increased a further 20%. So compared to 2014, from 2014 to 2016, anti-Muslim hate crimes have doubled in this country. And again, that's looking at data that is likely underreporting the reality of the situation. If you look at reports from civil society organizations, they draw a much more alarming picture of the actual scale of the hate crimes that we're talking about. And you know, when you say hate crimes, you might think of this in an abstract way, but very concretely, we're talking about physical assaults. Last year, the number of physical assaults against Muslims reported to the FBI, to law enforcement, was the highest since 2001. And there are a number of very prominent incidents over the past few years where people have been murdered because of anti-Muslim bias. We saw this in Portland, where bystanders intervened to prevent a Muslim woman from being attacked on a subway, and they were murdered by the assailant. We saw two Indian American individuals who were shot in Kansas because they were perceived to be Muslim. There were murders in North Carolina of individuals by a neighbor who had anti-Muslim bias. There was a shooting in Washington State of a Sikh individual because of his perceived affiliation with Islam. So when we talk about hate crimes, this is very real. People's lives are being impacted. People are unfortunately suffering the ultimate consequences of this type of hate. And not only can you see that uptick in crimes, but there are also studies that have been done recently in the past year that have drawn direct causal relationships between the rhetoric that we're seeing from political leaders. I'm going to cite 3 studies specifically, but there are more out there that are doing this. There is a study from the University of Warwick that looked at how anti-Muslim tweets coming from President Trump impacted the levels of hate crimes in certain areas. And this study, filtering out for all other possible influences, found that when the president was tweeting anti-Muslim tweets, in areas where there was a high concentration of Twitter users, there was an uptick in anti-Muslim hate crimes. There's a study from the University of Kansas that looked at, using polling data, looked at whether there was a shift in social attitude or social norms about anti-Muslim discrimination. They found a very perceptible shift amongst the people who participated in the poll, that show that there was a shift in the perceived acceptability of anti-Muslim discrimination. In other words, because of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that we're seeing from individuals like President Trump and other officials, the bar for discrimination has lowered. Society had set a higher standard for ourselves, and it has now been lowered by the rhetoric that we're seeing from certain political leaders. There's also a Washington Post analysis from just a few months ago that they published of FBI data showing that there was a direct spike in hate crimes immediately after the election. So in other words, they're drawing a direct causal link between the election and hate crimes that were committed against Muslims. And that specific finding is also supported by reports by the Southern Poverty Law Center as well as by other civil society organizations like CARE. So we have very real consequences to the rhetoric that's out there, to the increase in discrimination and prejudice that we're seeing. And it's unfortunate, but there's a role that we all have to play in this. Over time, social norms develop, and one individual can affect things if that individual holds the highest office in the land. But as members of civil society, as citizens, as political leaders, public officials, elected leaders, our voices count and matter too. And so the recommendations that come out of our report are to encourage everyone, and particularly public officials and leaders, to speak out against intolerance, to condemn hate crimes, to condemn discrimination when they see it, to call out other officials when they aren't living up to the standards that we hold for ourselves, and the values that we strive to achieve as a country. And that's very important because, as you can see, social norms shift. It's a very dynamic situation, and although we're seeing an unfortunate decline in those standards at the moment, over time they will come back. And I think that's a resiliency that we've seen in America based on its treatment and mistreatment of various groups over time. And I believe the same will be true for Muslim Americans because of the reaction that we've seen from citizens across the country standing in solidarity with Muslim communities and others who've been under attack, including immigrant communities. Another aspect of the report that I didn't author but I want to mention is the rise in efforts to pass anti-Sharia bills in various state legislatures. There's a chapter in the book that goes into detail about this, but essentially there are a number of organizations that are very well funded, like Act for America, which have essentially used anti-Muslim and anti-Islam bias as a political tool, as a wedge issue, to get this issue before legislators in various state capitals, as well as in some cases on ballots, in order to motivate certain elements of their constituencies to get out and vote, but also really to further the demonization of Muslim communities and Islam. And it's exactly the misinformation about Sharia that Daisy was talking about in her remarks that they're using and exploiting to try to create a situation where they can pass some sort of legislation which purports to restrict the practice of religious obligations, essentially, that are elements of tenets of religious faith. And various attempts to pass this legislation has succeeded in a number of states. They've also been challenged in court, and courts have struck some of them down. But that's an ongoing battle that's happening in many state localities. So I just wanted to make sure to do that.
Thank you so much, Aslan. I'd like to invite Susanna Cunningham, Executive Director of Only Through Us, also has worked very closely with us to ensure a successful briefing. Thank you, Susanna. And we've been on the phone, Skypes, and everything else. I can't tell you, this is completely voluntary, and she's come all the way from California.
Thank you very much, Daisy. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I think this is a very important topic, and I'm honored to be on a panel with such experts, the diverse spectrum on this issue. I want to say, Only Through Us, our mission is to empower communities to counter fear-based policymaking in the wake of terror attacks. So immediately when I say terror attacks, the topic of today's discussion is how we approach and destigmatize, but also how we deal with security issues. And that's at the center of the work that we do. And we also seek to hold policymakers accountable for their decisions and their votes, because they, as Arsalan pointed out, as Daisy pointed out, the things that our legislators say has implications not only in policy, but in our communities as a message, and as a dog whistle. So the question that I want to say, there are a number of examples that we talk about fear-based policymaking in the wake of terror attacks. We see 5 pattern responses that we consider our pillar issues. In the wake of terror attacks, we see assaults on the refugee program, assaults on religious inclusion in America. We see political attacks on Muslim Americans and associated communities. We see efforts to repopulate Guantanamo Bay. We've seen this in the last 12 months. We see efforts to resanction torture and a referendum on torture. So these issues engage only thrusts and engage many of our community members on trying to protect civil rights, while we're also trying to keep America safe. And on this issue, you can look at an example, many examples or common examples that we might know. Look at the Iraq War. Many of us see that as a not only waste of human life, American resources, and the political space to make change in our government that we all need, that I think Americans are asking for. Much of that, including trillions of dollars and lives, were spent in a war that did not make us safer and actually distracted resources away from programs and strategies that would have made us safer. But let's ask a question about something that's a little closer to home. We look at refugees as an example of this insecurity, either with regard to national security or with jobs. We see refugees really in the political world, particularly in Washington, D.C., as a political football on these issues of security, national security, and jobs. And refugees being the most vulnerable communities in the world, that is particularly callous and cynical. So I'm going to sort of cite this, and I'm going to ask everyone, you don't have to cite whether or not your own family, but I want to ask whether in your family or in your extended family or a friend, do you know a refugee? And please raise your hand, or if you are a descendant of a refugee, all of the above. So thank you so much. I gather you also don't know whether or not you're friends of descendants of refugees. The descendant of my father was an Irish Catholic. And so we came here. We came here at a time where Catholics were not viewed very favorably. And we came here for opportunity, like many Americans had, and many of our ancestry had. So one of the questions is not just what Muslim Americans are, the question is what we are. And Daisy cited Jefferson, and she cited the Virginia statute on religious freedom. There are 2 things on Jefferson's gravestone. And that's one, it's not the president, it wasn't the former president of the US, it was the author of the American Declaration of Independence and the author of the Virginia statute on religious freedom. He considered those the 2 most important things he did with his life. He also, as she mentioned, when they were discussing what religious freedom would mean in America when they were founding it, they cited the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, the Catholic tradition, and of course the Protestant tradition. These were not things that they came too lightly. They were discussed in our very DNA, in our very founding. And the reason why I want to say this to start is because what terrorism seeks to do is to change the way that we view ourselves. It changes the way we operate. It has a political and military strategy that fundamentally tries to empower and exploit the fear you would have after a terror attack and to operationalize it. In April, earlier this year, we had an event, Only Through Us had an event with General Michael Hayden and former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. And there, Hayden highlighted the way that we were following into propaganda hands, along with a researcher from University of Chicago, Robert Pate. And we investigated what were the national security implications of one policy, such as the Muslim ban. What were the implications of it? And there's a quote that I'll use from Hayden that I've used for a while, and he repeats it. Terrorism is not an existential threat to America. and this is a former CIA NSA director and General Michael Hayden. Terrorism is not an existential threat to America, but our reaction to it might be. The way that we respond, the way we treat fellow Americans, the way we build military strategy and intelligence strategy matters. So by legislators, and we can also say media, they have a responsibility not to offer us a cynical, easy offering of fear-based policymaking, saying that if you go to Iraq, somehow that'll make America safer, or that if you stop refugees coming, somehow that'll make you safer. We have an obligation to offer smart, strategic strategy. So one of the references that we use in relation to the Muslim ban, we talk about what can Capitol Hill do about that? Because that was administrative policy. The example we have is a trial balloon. The Muslim ban actually was first seen as a trial balloon in a piece of legislation that was passed by the House called the SAFE Act in 2015. In November 2015, the House, with full Republican support and 47 Democrats, passed a piece of legislation that would have stopped refugee resettlement of Syrians and Iraqis, including Iraqis who work with coalition forces and American organizations like the Red Cross. The House and Capitol Hill had an opportunity to show leadership, and this piece of legislation was presented a week after the Paris attacks. French intelligence 24 hours after the attack said that there was no affiliations between refugees and the attack in Paris, but that did not stop the House from passing that piece of legislation. And it is no surprise that that confirmation on Capitol Hill further supported the fear-based policymaking that was happening in state legislatures on anti-Sharia legislation, empowering extremist communities like Act for America, in there for 47 cents a day, you can stop Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, these are snake oil salesmen going into our communities and saying, hey, that natural fear you have, I can offer you a solution. But it's one that is based on undermining the principles of America. It's one that's based on undermining religious freedom in America. It's ones that go after the most vulnerable people in the world, largely who are women and children. That is a false promise of security. But we do have to figure out how to answer national security concerns, and I think Daisy's Wise Up and the team that they put together tries to do just that. They try to say, okay, you have a natural fear. Let's talk about how far back Muslim Americans have been involved in the foundation of America, and let's talk about what they do in our communities. So, how do we offer something that is real strategic opportunities for leadership on Capitol Hill? Daisy said here that there needs to be a tremendous amount done on cultural competencies and understanding Muslim American communities. There also needs to stop being a conversation as if we understand the theology of a multi-billion person faith. The truth is that Capitol Hill, that we have a distinction between church and state for a reason. We don't get involved in theology. The second is that media has a responsibility on how they report. This is a new age, and I think that there really should be a referendum, starting at Columbia Journalism School, to really ask, as you're training journalists, what your responsibility is in a new age of both being part of an operationalized military strategy of terror networks and of hate groups. There's also anti-hate speech, which I know Engage has promoted. So opportunities of legislation that ask for protection of religious minorities, not even always minorities, and protection against hate speech and hate crimes. And then there's also, I want to highlight the last one because I highlighted refugee issues. Before Obama left, he set 2017, President Obama left, he set 2017 strategic quotas on refugee acceptance to 110,000. President Trump lowered that to historic lows that had never been seen since the quota system had been started. And he lowered it to 45,000 for this year. That year of acceptance is about to end, and we have only accepted 16,000. If you compare, it's not just how many we have accepted, It's the kind that we have accepted. In 7 months under Obama, in the last year of the Obama administration, we accepted 33,500 Muslim refugees. In the same 7-month period under Trump, President Trump, we accepted 2,225. That's a 93% decrease on Muslim refugees acceptance. 93. If you don't think that this is a policy, I'm happy to talk to you more about the details of that. Protecting religious inclusion means not strategically choosing what type of religious faith we'd like to have in America. And the last I'd say is the national security opportunities that we really do, and dedicating resource to what is actually the challenge. And most of that has to do, a huge portion of that has to do with working on propaganda and communication issues, which the government has under-resourced.
Thank you so much, Susanna. You can see that we have a lot to say, and I think, Tom, we may have to have another briefing because this is not enough. The conversation is getting started. And I do want to say one thing, Susanna. You mentioned about resources. We were doing work in Afghanistan training imams, and after we finished training the imams, they said, we wish you hadn't spent $1 billion. We wish you had only spent $1 million on training us, and we would have been the shield against Taliban, and you would have had to shed your blood. So it's important to know that, the work that we have been doing really needs to be at the grassroots community level, not Kinetic's approach, always. I want to introduce the next section. I'm going to skip over these recommendations because you have them in your brief, but basically, support, I'm not going to go through it because we don't have enough time. I want to do a quick time check. We were supposed to end at 10:15 so we could do a Q&A. How many of you can still stay on? Most of you? Okay, well, not all of you. So we're going to go very quickly. Dahlia, the pressure is on you. I'm sorry. So the American Muslim community is perceived largely through a national security lens. Dahlia, I don't even have to tell you who she is. She's a star in our community. Everybody knows her. She does incredible work with ISPU. They do incredible research on this community. So it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Daisy. Thank you all for being here this morning. I direct research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We are a DC and Detroit-based think tank, and we focus our research entirely on the issues and challenges and the opportunities of the American Muslim community. We've heard a lot about societal anti-Muslim bias. We've also heard about how that bias can seep into policy. What I'd like to cover very briefly in my remarks is research that we have conducted on empirically what that bias looks like, both in the judicial and law enforcement systems as well as in the media. And I'd like to specifically focus on what we term as foiled plots. So these are people accused of plotting to carry out ideologically motivated violence. And we did an empirical comparison from 2002 until 2015 of these types of foiled plots, things that were not carried out, and looked at whether or not the perpetrator is perceived to be Muslim or not perceived to be Muslim. So we did category A, perceived to be Muslim, and category B, perceived to be non-Muslim. So here's what we found. In the case of a perpetrator who is perceived to be Muslim acting in the name of Islam, a foiled plot received 770% more media coverage in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. We focused on those two print media. So far more media coverage if the perpetrator is perceived to be Muslim versus somebody acting in the name of white supremacy or an anti-government ideology. The second thing we found is that law enforcement behaves very differently with these two types of groups. In 2/3 of the perceived to be Muslim group, these foiled plots included a sting operation in which the weaponry for the alleged plot was supplied by law enforcement. In the case of the non-Muslim group, the weapon is most often procured by the individual themselves and not given to them by law enforcement. Now that has very real consequences, because when it comes to charging that person, the perceived Muslim perpetrator was much more often charged with, quote, a weapon of mass destruction. Why? Because the weapon was in fact handed to them by law enforcement. And that has very real consequences in terms of sentencing. So the perceived Muslim plot would average 4 times the sentencing for very similar types of plots as the non-Muslims. So the average sentence for a Muslim perceived perpetrator was 25 years versus 2.5 years, or sometimes even 2 to 3 years on the side of the non-Muslim perpetrator. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for the individuals, of course, that suffer those consequences, but it also makes us generally less safe. It makes us less safe if we have a systematic bias in our judicial system or in our media, whereby we perceive certain threats worse than other threats, despite the fact that they are equally impactful in terms of the harm that they are likely to bring on. So the main point of this study is that equal conduct should receive equal treatment in law enforcement and in the media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. And thank you for staying so brief. But you can read their report. They have an excellent report. You can download it, ISPU. I would like to introduce, sure, please, come on up to the podium. Salam Mariati also does not need an introduction. He is the founder of MPAC, and they also do incredible amount of report, but also he's a contributor to Wise Up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daisy Khan and Wise Up for hosting this, and thank you to the Congressman for having us here. So everything's been said, but not everybody has said it. So I'll be very brief. I'll just leave you with 2 points. The first point is, what is the driver behind all of this? Why are we having a problem? I mean, when we talk about the Muslim problem, that's a problem in and of itself. And it already puts the paradigm that Muslims and Islam do not belong in the West. And so we could have 2 narratives. One narrative is that America is at war with Islam. And that is the driver behind religious nationalism. Not just Muslim religious nationalism, but Judeo-Christian religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is the greatest threat to religion. Not secularism. Secularism is the way that religion can actually flourish when governments cannot adopt and sponsor one religion over another, or governments cannot adopt an ideology that is opposed to even the people of the same faith of that government, which is what we're seeing in the Middle East today. And so we have religious nationalism in the Middle East, in Tehran, in Cairo, but we have it here in America too. The Muslim travel ban is an expression of religious nationalism that is polarizing this country between Islam and the West. Islam versus the West is the lie that keeps on giving. It gives us wars, it gives us terrorism, it gives us radicalization, it gives us ghettoization, and then it gives us all these national security problems that we have to deal with. And so it's one thing to say we have to be fair about an issue, but we cannot achieve a solution by just being fair over a problem that is corrupted within its core. We have to deal with the corruption of the core and clean it out first. And the answer to religious nationalism is religious pluralism. Religious pluralism for Muslims mean I have the American Muslim identity, that I am a practicing American Muslim and proud of both of those components of my identity. When the President of the United States goes to Saudi Arabia and starts talking about Islam, but completely ignores the American Muslim community, or when he has a Ramadan iftar in the White House with foreign diplomats omitting the contributions, the speech, the work of American Muslims, that, again, is an expression of religious nationalism. Our world is suffering from half of it disobeying God and half of it not even believing in God. And when you put words in the mouth of God, that is the worst sin in religion. When you use the Bible to say that separation of families is justified, when you use the Quran to say it is okay to kill a baby, that is the corruption within the core of religion, and religious nationalism is the greatest threat to us. Number two, the answer lies in engagement. Nations fail when the center collapses. The media is not here because they're paying attention to the extremes. They don't pay attention to the middle road, to the middle space, to those who are practicing their religion in a decent way. And so the way to counter this idea of Islam versus the West, or America's at war with Islam, is to establish and magnify and amplify and manifest that America is the best place for Muslims to worship freely. I am more free as a Muslim in America than I would be in Saudi Arabia or Iran today. And so to express that and to work on national security, on civil liberties, on what makes our country great, that is the answer to religious nationalism and to terrorism. And now even law enforcement in their work are saying we need to move the Muslim community affairs outside of counterterrorism. It's 18 years, maybe late, but it's not too late. Even law enforcement is beginning to see that we cannot see Muslims only through the lens of security, but to see them as those civically engaged as every other American. We have to celebrate successes. ISIS has gone from cells that we have to worry about to ISIS lone wolves to now ISIS-inspired social media deranged people. That is a success. But when the threat goes from the threat of ISIS to the threat of the mere existence of Muslims in the West, that is a problem on how we're looking at the problem. And so the Quran says, repel that good and evil are not equal. Repel evil with that which is good, so that the one with whom there is enmity becomes as if he or she has always been your closest and warmest friend. Religion is telling us we don't need religious conversion. We need social conversion. Thank you.
Well, you can see that we have a lot of tasks in here. There is engage directly with members of the Muslim community, include Muslim experts and representatives, assign one of the community liaisons, outreach. There's tons of recommendations. I cannot go into each and every one of them, but I thank Salam. Thank you very much for wrapping it up. I think that now is the time to demonstrate our commitment to the Constitution, bring us back to the Constitution and our shared values, our religious values, and to strive to reassert our moral authority, both at home and abroad. And this requires us representing the true views of who we are as Muslims and who we are as Americans. What's up for next? Just so you know what we are going to do, we are doing town halls across the country to engage the general public, because it's not sufficient for us to just come and meet with all of you. We need to meet with people eyeball to eyeball to have a conversation one-on-one. We are doing targeted educational materials. You can see that we've already engaged a friend of ours who's a Marine who was supposed to be here today but not, and he recommended that Wise Up create a cargo pant version. And you can see we actually have already started it. Cargo pant version is being created. We want to do translations in Arabic, Urdu, French, German, Dari, +++. Anybody interested in translating this material for overseas consumption and for local community consumption, we're all ears. We will be doing community trainings, resiliency trainings at the ground level. We will be digitizing this for social media consumption, and we will be digitizing both Wise Up and after we have met with Rachel and other people and created a task force to show the commonalities, and that will be digitized because we have to be just as smart as the extremists are in using social media, because there's no counter to the social media, and it's not big enough. It's not we don't have enough stakeholders connected together, and but we also want to create a digital platform for engaging the American public. So we'll just give you a quick sample of something that we just did with a friend of ours, Paul. And Paul, could you come up here 1 second, please, so that we can, Lisa, how do I play this? Click it? Click what? Click what? Okay, this is my right arm.
I often say, I have a friend who really embodies everything I associate with being American. He's got a job with freedom, a family he loves and can provide for, and he's fulfilled by his connection to the landscape and society of America. His name is Mirwais, and he's a Muslim man I met in Afghanistan where he was my local interpreter. These days, he drives his 18-wheeler back and forth across the United States with a big smile on his face. But a lot of Americans have never met someone like Mirwais. They've never shared a meal, gone to the movies with him, watched a baseball game, or any other normal thing y'all do in America with someone who is Muslim.
A lot of our knowledge of the Muslim community in America comes from the news, which is often paired with violent, threatening language. The news tends to focus on the perceived otherness and fear-based themes. But the millions of Muslims living in the U.S. are trying to work hard, learn, spend time with family and friends, and have fun, just as we all do.
That's Daisy Khan, director of a woman-led organization committed to peace building, equality, and justice for Muslims around the world called WISE. The truth is, Muslims living in America are just as likely to identify as American as they are Muslim, and they're patriotic. Today, almost 4,000 Muslims serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. There are 700 Muslim police officers in the New York Police Department alone, and American Muslims are the single largest source of tips to law enforcement agencies in foiling Muslim terrorists. And there's that word on everyone's mind, terrorist. The misconception in America is that Muslims are responsible for most acts of terrorism in the U.S. Muslim terrorists are infiltrating our borders. Refugees are coming into America to attack us in the name of Islam, and that all terrorists are Muslim. Although that's the predominant narrative in the news, it's very far from the truth. Here's what the statistics really look like.
230,000 Americans have been murdered since 9/11. 123 of those fatalities were committed by Muslims. Of the 85,000 refugees that entered the U.S. in 2016, 46%, that's 39,000 of them, were Muslim. Not a single Muslim refugee has committed an act of terrorism. Every year, the U.S. grants green cards to 1 million immigrants who have entered the country lawfully, and 100,000 of these are Muslims. There is no concrete evidence of a mass movement where Muslims are infiltrating the U.S. No one from any of the 6 Muslim-majority countries has been banned from entering the U.S. 99% of American Muslims have had zero involvement with terrorists or terrorism. From 1980 to 2005, American Muslims were responsible for only 6% of attacks in the U.S.
During my first combat tours of duty in the Marine Corps, I wasn't able to connect with the local community. I'd walk in with full body armor and tell a group of people I needed them to give me information. I intimidated a lot of people in the process, but I never got reliable results. On my last tour, I learned to change my talking points and emphasize what we have in common so we could work together and trust each other. We all had families to protect, wanted the freedom to love and worship and to have a happy life, and the cooperation was extremely effective.
In the U.S., we need to think about things in a similar way. If we're to have a more inclusive and safer community, we need to listen and respect each other. What we all have in common is a shared home in the United States. If we want it to be safer and more free, we need to make a meaningful connection based on our shared values so we can work together to keep the country safe. So fellow people of the U.S., let's try a little harder to talk to each other, eat food together, share our stories, and have fun with each other. Because the more we get to know the faces and stories of the people we share this country with, the less threatening it will seem, and the more secure it will become. God bless America.
Thank you, Paul. If you could just come here 1 second. So Paul was at one of my book readings, and he was just in the audience, a random, as I call him,